Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. Boris Tizenhausen here with you. It's December 9th. Today's episode will be packed. German intelligence claims that Putin has only 18 months worth of war funds left. After that, complete bankruptcy. SBU drones have destroyed a strategic gas terminal in Temryuk. And also about the disgrace of the Russian aerospace forces. Today they lost a unique aircraft along with its entire crew. And that's not all. Two pilots of a bomber that was bombing Ukraine self-destructed in a very strange way, about how Poland is arming itself to the teeth and seems to be becoming the new leader of Europe, about a deal with the devil. Trump sold military technology to China for a hefty commission, and Putin's insane order. Putin ordered the economy to grow immediately, and he also ordered Russian babies to be born immediately. About a bloody return. It turns out that these so-called war heroes in Russia are coming home, and they've already killed some insane number of Russians there in their own country. I'll tell you that number today. I think you'll be shocked too. And about this and more, there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff in today's episode. If you're new to the channel, welcome. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And let's start with this news. Another disaster has happened in Russia. A military transport plane, an An-22, crashed in the Ivanovo region. It was on a flight after repairs and crashed in an uninhabited area. There were 7 crew members on board. No one survived. What a pity, as they say. A search and rescue team was dispatched. So why is this not just an ordinary loss for the Russians? The An-22, the so-called Antey, is the largest turboprop aircraft in the world. These planes were produced back in the 1960s, so even the youngest of them is about 50 years old, and these planes are rare in Russia. That is, of course, they can't produce them themselves. They resort to aircraft cannibalization. Out of the 60 planes that were once produced in Russia, only 3 or 4 were still operational, and losing one of them is a very serious matter. Just imagine, they lost 1 out of 3. So, what's special about this Antey? First of all, it can carry up to 60 tons of cargo, and it was used to transport oversized equipment. In other words, whatever couldn't fit in the Ilyushins could fit in the Antey. They were used to transport air defense systems to Syria, among other things. And they are used to move air defense systems closer to the front lines, as well as to transport helicopters. It's very convenient. If a few helicopters are damaged, they're so large that you just remove the rotors and load the entire helicopter into the An like that. That's it. Moreover, local eyewitnesses say that the engine literally fell off in flight from this Antey, and of course over there in Russia they immediately started to glorify the crew according to the usual script. Since it crashed somewhere in an uninhabited area, it means the pilot did everything possible to steer the plane away from residential buildings. But the locals say that the engine caught fire and it immediately went into a spin. In other words, no one was steering anything anywhere. They crashed right there, basically on the spot. And that's great news, especially because among the pilots were the very same ones who also take part in transporting military cargo for the war against Ukraine. But that's not all. Just a day ago, Russian military public pages reported yet another terrible piece of news for them. Terrible for them, but accordingly, wonderful news for the entire civilized world. At one of Russia's military airfields, inside a bomber that was parked in a concrete shelter, like a hangar or a concrete revetment, the ejection system accidentally went off while 2 pilots were preparing the plane for takeoff. I think many of you have already figured out what happened. The seats shot straight into the concrete ceiling. And of course, those pilots were simply smashed to pieces in there, because it's not a spring that fires them out. It's basically a rocket engine that launches them up to 100 meters high with a force of 10 Gs. And so right into the hangar ceiling, those pilots were obliterated. In other words, there was no chance of survival. As they say, tears make it hard to speak. In this case, tears of joy. 2 monsters who bombed Ukraine have self-destructed, so it seems karma rolled up its sleeves this week when it comes to Russian pilots. But unfortunately, the entire Russian army can't just wipe itself out like that. Unfortunately, I repeat, it falls to our heroes to eliminate them, and under extremely difficult conditions, they are now standing up to the Russians. Putin is doing everything possible to bite off at least another piece of Ukrainian land, even just a little. But our soldiers are heroes. Let me remind you, friends, we have a new fundraiser for the 34th Coastal Defense Brigade, which is holding the line in the Kherson direction. These are our glorious Marines. They were among those who liberated Kherson. So I strongly urge you to join this fundraiser. And you know, every fundraiser has its own story. That is, I always get in touch, find out, and talk to those who need help. And this time, some friends of mine said, our Marines in the Kherson direction need help. Just the other day, the Russians took down one of their Mavics with electronic warfare. They urgently need help buying more of these Mavics. So I said, give me a contact. And I got in touch. A servicewoman from the 34th Coastal Defense Brigade, Samira, wrote to me. Here she is, Samira. So we had a call. And Samira, I could tell right away, she gets straight to the point. Very specific. Okay, we need Mavics. They can be slightly used. We need this, we need that. Check for this, for that. She explained everything thoroughly, step by step. I thought, where does she get these skills from? And then I found out she has 3 kids. That's where this precise, time-efficient briefing comes from. With such a hands-on approach, the brigade definitely won't be left without drones. And every time I am convinced what extraordinary people live in Ukraine and defend Ukraine. Well, a little bit about Samira. She is Azerbaijani by origin, a citizen of Ukraine, volunteered from 2014 to 2022, and since 2022 has been serving in the armed forces of Ukraine. She is stationed in Kherson and is a drone pilot in the 34th Coastal Defense Brigade. And we recorded a video message for you, friends. Please take a look.
Бажаємо здоров'я!
Ми бійці 34-ї бригади берегової оборони міста Херсон, підрозділ БПЛА. Звертаємося за допомогою до Бориса Тізенгаузена та його спільноти в придбанні для нашого підрозділу Mavic 3 Pro для виконання бойових завдань та знищення ворога. Разом до перемоги! Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Let's help our brave Marines, let's help Samira, let's help her fellow soldiers. The link to donate is in the description of this video. There is Mono, Private and PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. And to each of you, as always, I say a huge thank you. You are simply incredible. If you don't see the payment details here, there's always a QR code you can use to access them. One more piece of good news. Yesterday, we completed the fundraising for our Azov fighters. I got in touch with them. They're just shocked by how fast it happened. So they send you all a huge hello and thank you. We've already ordered the RNK, the ground drone, and there will be some upgrades as well. In short, they send you a huge thank you. In the context of Putin's recent nervous statements that Russia is ready to go to war with Europe at any moment, I keep coming across more and more materials like this. Of this kind? Bild writes that Putin has enough money for another 18 years. Months of war against Ukraine. They refer to classified reports by German economic experts and intelligence data. They monitor the actual state of Russia's gold and foreign currency reserves. So it's a kind of mathematical model that takes into account revenues, including oil and gas expenses and the war. Social spending adjusted for the new sanctions, plus there's also the naval blockade. Now it also includes the drop in profits there, specifically in the Black Sea. It's simple math. And the calculation is based on the depletion of the National Wealth Fund, the main one, and this so-called Putin's stash. First of all, Putin has already started selling gold. This is already the final stage. The oil noose, in other words, the rising cost of logistics. Insurance has tripled in the Black Sea thanks to Ukrainian drones. Oil prices have dropped and Russia's margin has become minimal due to new sanctions. And on top of that, there's monstrous inflation for Russia. It was a revelation to me as well that one day of war in 2025 costs almost twice as much as it did in 2022. Not only because of inflation, but also because at that time, Ukraine couldn't disable Russian oil refineries and terminals in such numbers. But now that's exactly what's happening. First, Russia can't process the oil, so they have to dump crude oil somewhere. Second, they have to repair everything, which costs a huge amount of money. So in general, the war has become much more expensive for Putin. And naturally, that's why the European Union's move to confiscate Russia's frozen assets is causing such hysteria right now. The Russians, or rather those in the Kremlin, thought they still had a reserve, that soon the sanctions would be lifted, those 300 billion would be unfrozen. Great. But that's not how it turned out. The Russian vodka-soaked Chucky doll Dmitry Medvedev sends threats to European officials every day. I'm telling you for sure. And that's why we see news from Russia every day about payments being cancelled. Residents of the Kursk region are being denied compensation for destroyed housing. Teachers' salaries are being cut, almost threefold. The signing bonus for contracts with the Ministry of Defense is being cut. VAT and other taxes are being raised, as well as recycling fees and so on. And so on. In other words, Putin is vacuuming up his entire country right now, hoping to scrape together more money for the war, looking for anywhere else he can get it. Of course, this doesn't mean the war will end in 18 months. There's still room to raise taxes on Russians. They can always squeeze more. You could also tap into the private deposits of Russian citizens, couldn't you? And by the way, they've already done this without Russians' knowledge, but Ukraine and its allies will always have new surprises in store for the balding ruler of the swamps. By the way, these strikes on tankers in the Black Sea, they could significantly shorten the time it takes to drain the Russian treasury. And while I have the chance, I want to express my immense gratitude to everyone who is helping Ukraine. This is a very difficult time for Ukraine, and Ukrainians will not forget it. And here's some news about how Ukraine is shortening the time it takes to drain the Russian treasury. The results of the recent strike on the port of Temryuk are now known, and things are very problematic there. For the Russians, everything happened. The port of Temryuk, Krasnodar Krai, on the Sea of Azov. Drones arrived, SBU drones, or as we call them here, God's service, and put on a spectacular fire show at the Maktren oil terminal, destroying 20 out of 30 huge gas storage tanks. In other words, it was a total destruction of the storage facility. The fire was fought for 3 days, and let's take a look at how the Russians shot down their own gas terminal. Ukrainian drones also destroyed the railway overpass where gas is transferred from trains. Well, the terminal basically turned into a pile of scrap metal. This terminal used to pump 400,000 tons of gas for export, but it no longer exists. But perhaps the most painful thing for the Kremlin isn't even the gas itself. They could have still pumped in as much iron as they wanted because this terminal was built in 2008, right when Putin got carried away with his delusions of grandeur, that he was some great conqueror. The pumps, compressors, electronics, as you can imagine, all of it was Western-made. There's nothing to replace them with. Chinese equivalents, but those would blow up even faster. So the SBU didn't just burn gas, they basically wiped out a major gas logistics hub. And the Russians never expected they'd have to defend so many facilities on their own territory. And a gas terminal is basically a powder keg. Why did 20 of those storage tanks burn down? Because a domino effect occurred. So the liquefied gas that was pumped into those tanks, if one tank gets hit, it explodes, creates a shockwave, thermal radiation, and immediately deforms the neighboring tank. Basically, boom, 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 and that's how everything blew up. It was a chain reaction, they couldn't stop it, and it took 3 days to put out the fire. Burn in hell, you idiots. What else can be said here? By the way, Russia's expulsion and isolation opened up the opportunity not only for the US to take over the European market. I see that some countries are doing exactly the right thing by simply stepping into this market where Russians used to be. For example, Poland. Poland is just killing it. Poland, it seems to me, wants to become the main hub for exporting liquefied natural gas to Europe. So they're building a floating terminal. And they've already planned the construction of a second one. In other words, they're arming themselves as if they're getting ready to fight the whole world, and a neighboring galaxy too. And they're absolutely right to do so. So, by the way, Poland has already set its sights on the new Swedish Saab A-26 submarines. They want to replace their old Soviet Kilo-class submarines. Well, that's the right move, absolutely the right thing to do. These submarines that Poland wants to acquire, the Saab A-26, they're silent and have a lockout chamber for naval special forces to exit, so it's perfectly suited for the Baltic Sea. It's a direct threat to the Russian fleet in Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg. Poland is currently undergoing probably the largest rearmament in NATO's history. They've ordered HIMARS by the hundreds, literally. They've ordered more HIMARS than most NATO countries combined. Plus, now they're getting Korean Fa-50 jets and F-35s for themselves. And Poland has also decided not to create internal problems for itself. It turns out that the European Union has agreed to exempt Poland from accepting migrants in 2026, according to the head of the Polish Ministry of Internal Affairs, Mr. Karwinski. Well, Poland is finally establishing itself as the new leader of Eastern Europe, shifting the center. The balance of power is shifting away from the Berlin-Paris axis towards Warsaw, Kyiv, and London. Logically, a new military alliance would probably form here. Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Britain. I would also definitely add Finland to this group. After all, Finland has gone through almost the same thing that Ukraine is going through now. In exactly the same way, once the enormous USSR attacked Finland under the pretext that the Finns, just think about it, the Finns supposedly wanted to attack the Soviet Union. And just like now, they expected to take Helsinki in 3 days, and again it was the huge Soviet Union. They got bogged down in that winter war, took a beating from the Finns, and suffered huge losses. Yes, Finland unfortunately lost part of its territory, but it preserved its nation and sovereignty. Years would pass, and Finland would become probably, well, not probably, but by all indicators, one of the happiest and most prosperous countries in Europe. Meanwhile, the lands occupied by the Soviet Union would turn into one of the most depressed regions, even within Russia itself. And this wizard of the brown city, Putin, is driving them even deeper into depression. By the way, friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Here, we're not only fighting against Russian propaganda on which Putin spends colossal amounts of money, we're also exposing the lies of this entire dictatorial gang. So subscribe and let's see how many of us there are. Donald Trump surprised me again. He unfroze the supply of advanced artificial intelligence processors to China. That is, he approved the sale to Beijing of the second most powerful NVIDIA H200 chip. The New York Times reports this. But this decision looks extremely strange because earlier Trump spoke about a policy of rejection and restriction of AI chip sales to China. So of course Trump explained why he is selling these chips. According to him, 25% will be paid to the US as additional profit, and supporting jobs will strengthen manufacturing in the US, bringing benefits to American taxpayers. Overall, this event is a kind of tectonic shift that shows what the new White House policy looks like. Just a few days ago, an updated national security strategy was published, in which China is named as the main and only threat. The main and only one. The ink hasn't even dried yet on this national security strategy. As we can see, the enemy is of course the enemy, but 25% commission is still 25% commission. Trump, who positions himself as the toughest anti-China president, I think the Pentagon was shocked by this move. I mean, it's not just hardware being sold to China. What's being sold is time. China is about 3 to 5 years behind in developing its own chips. And by selling as many as 200, the US is allowing Beijing to close this gap. So let's imagine that in 1940, the US was selling aviation aluminum to Japan because it was profitable for American taxpayers. Well, that's just ridiculous. Well, China, these chips, they're dual use, meaning they can be used for training neural networks, including swarm control, drones, cyber warfare. You can do much more with these chips and a lot of other things as well. That's why this is an incredibly powerful chip. Trump says, it's an old chip, we're already moving on to a new one. No, this is a very powerful chip. But here I brought up this news in the context of, why then is Russia not allowed to buy chips for missiles? That's the question people will ask. Well, if the main criteria are profit and keeping the taxpayer happy and creating jobs, then where is the red line at all? Moreover, China is named as the main enemy in the national security strategy, but Russia is not. So why not sell them chips for missiles? Or why just chips? Why not sell them entire missiles? Why not sell? The taxpayer would be happy. There would be jobs. Basically, money has defeated national security. That's sad. Now, any dictator understands that the US is not a wall, it's just a matter of price. I think that's really quite very sad. And here, the phrase often attributed to Vladimir Lenin, though he never actually said it, fits very well. But the phrase really hits the mark. The capitalists themselves will sell us the rope with which we will hang them. I think it's impossible to come up with anything more accurate than that. I think that from now on, this phrase will become Xi Jinping's favorite, especially in the context of these latest decisions and, well, the news. Putin has acknowledged, it turns out, the failure of attempts to make Russian women have more children. I recently came across one of his speeches. Every time Putin speaks in front of his associates, it's just, like a gathering of zombies, this mothballed Politburo, all around 90 years old, just sitting there. All these Soviet relics are sitting there, these Komsomol members frozen in amber, reading from their papers in 500-point font. No one is interested. Someone is snoring. Someone is just staring off into space like some kind of wild animal. So, at one of these speeches in a gilded hall, Putin was reading from a piece of paper saying that people don't want to have children. And do you know what reason he gave? Just don't laugh. According to him, there are objective reasons why Russia is currently facing a demographic crisis. First of all, its external challenges and the overlapping demographic waves from the mid and late 20th century, which are making themselves felt again. What are you talking about, you bald fool? And now for the most interesting part. With the next statement, the cringe meter is showing an absolutely abnormal level of cringe, and Putin says the following phrase: "Our long-term historical task is to preserve and increase our people," declared the balding mummy. Can you imagine that? To start a completely senseless war? To kill more than 1 million Russians in it, and if you count how many more have left, also millions. To turn both Russia and Russians into pariahs. That's how he understands it. The preservation and increase, supposedly, of the people. Just so you understand, last year the birth rate in Russia dropped to its lowest point since 1999, for the entire period of Putin's rule. And this year it dropped another 4%. And it broke anti-records for the past 200 years. In response, what did they do in Russia? That's right, Rosstat classified the demographic statistics. That's it. That's all they can do. Here's another remarkable piece of news that shows what kind of world Putin lives in. He, Putin, ordered the economy to be immediately accelerated to global growth rates. This is not a joke. That is, the Russian government should immediately begin implementing a plan there. Blah blah blah, structural changes, cluck cluck cluck, woof woof woof, which will supposedly allow the Russian economy to grow at a rate no lower than the global average. The Botox jellyfish has ordered the economy to speed up. So he's giving out orders. Let me remind you that before every presidential term, Putin tells similar fairy tales. I issue a decree, so let's become like China or the USA now. He just... When was that? In the early 2010s, he came up with a strategy called 2020. GDP growth by almost 70%. The real income and well-being was supposed to grow by 64%. In the end, in reality, GDP didn't grow by 70%, but by 5%. And Russians' incomes didn't increase by 64%, but actually fell by 5%. Well, it's nothing. I mean, we almost made it, right? Why doesn't he just set a goal for Russia to surpass the US in GDP by Friday? Well, it's the same story. And so that by Friday, the Russian Moskvich would be better than a Mercedes. And would fly into space right away, too. This senile madman thinks the economy obeys orders. It seems to me that Putin is very close to solving this task of his, as if he could just wave his hand with a magic wand and by the next morning make the Russian economy surpass the economies of the US and China combined. He's already close to achieving this. That's why he's creating an isolated internet in Russia. So when the external internet is cut off, which will happen soon, the only information on the permitted sites will be exactly that. Putin has accelerated the economy and overtaken the US. Just like in North Korea's closed-off internet, in that internet, Kwangmyong, in the same way Russia will have nothing but victories one after another. Russia has defeated everyone. There's no life behind the Iron Curtain. Everyone died a long time ago. There, it's just a bunch of people with non-traditional values jumping around. Don't go there. Here in Russia, everything is wonderful, everything is great. Recently, I came across a video by a Western blogger who managed to get smartphones from North Korea, and he explained and showed how they work. That is, the Wi-Fi module there is completely not active. To access the isolated internet, you have to enter your social card information. But the most interesting thing is that the smartphone constantly takes screenshots of the screen and saves them in a special folder. You can't delete them from there, and you can't view them either. Where does it send them? Well, it's obvious where it sends them. In Russia, by the way, they came up with the National Messenger Max for this purpose, which does all the same things, maybe even worse. So that's that. And now, for the cherry on top at the end of the episode. Remember, I told you how Putin released the most terrifying scum from prisons. Cannibals, serial killers, maniacs, dismemberers. And he promised them a pardon if they would fight against Ukraine. So, how did that turn out? They go off to fight, receive Putin's presidential pardon, and some of them return. They come back home and commit serious crimes again. Statistics have come out, officially at least. These so-called heroes, cannibals with medals, have killed and maimed over 1,000 people. Already in Russia. This is just off the charts. These are understated figures. I think the real numbers are several times higher. And they've been pardoned again and sent back to the front. And just imagine, this is only a small part, a tiny percentage. If they all come back from the war, it will be hundreds of thousands. Can you imagine what will happen in Russia? It will be like some kind of post-apocalyptic movie scenario where crazed gangs of cannibals wearing medals are rampaging across Russia, shooting at each other. Well, and honestly, that's just fine. Our task as neighbors of an unstable country is simply to build a higher fence on the border, a moat with crocodiles, minefields, so that they can do whatever they want over there and never dare to make a move anywhere else again. Friends, I ask you very much, let's help our brave Marines on the Kherson front. They really need drones right now. Oh, how much they need them. Let's help Samira, let's help her fellow soldiers who are doing a very, very difficult job defending our country. The link to donate is in the description of this video. Wishing us all a peaceful day and glory to Ukraine.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.